Come in at this moment. It looks like it's perhaps too late. The door's being closed. My name's David Foster. I host a daily current affairs program for TRT World called Round Table. And we sit around and do what we're going to do tonight, which is talk about an issue we hope that is important to everybody. And we're talking about irregular migration and the holistic approach. Before I introduce our panel, I'm going to read something out here that comes from the Institute of Migration about irregular migration. It says it is the movement of persons that takes place outside the laws, the regulations or international agreements governing the entry into or exit from the state of origin, transit or destination. Please think about this. Is it illegal immigration dressed up with a fancy term? We'll come to that in just a moment. What I'd like to do is introduce my panel. Immediately to my left, we have Amin Salam, who's Minister of Trade and Economy for the Lebanon. Then we have Filippo Grande, who's UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and we'll try and get the distinction right between refugees and migrants. Savaş Umlo, President of Migration Management of the Ministry of the Interior for this country of Turkey. Then we have Leyla Kayacik, who's Special Representative of the Secretary General on Migration from the Refugees Council of Europe. The Council of Europe?
Council of Europe.
What did I
Council
say?
of Europe.
I'm sorry if I... Okay, I beg your pardon. Migration and Refugees of the Council of Europe. I do beg your pardon. And Martin Plum, Director Migration Dialogues and Cooperation at the International Centre for Migration Policy Development. We're going to talk to each individually as though this is just a conversation. And I'm going to bring with Amin a late entry onto the panel, I have to say. I didn't know until 15 minutes ago he was coming. But he has a personally interesting story, some of which I would like you to tell us about today. Because you're Minister of Trade and Economy for Lebanon, but you were a migrant. You're back in your home country now, but you migrated to the United States to find a better life for yourself and your family.
So, thank you, David, for this. As David mentioned, I jumped last minute on this panel because my morning panel was canceled due to flight changes. But I'm very happy to be part of this panel. I think this topic is very important, is very global, and it touches a lot of people in this world we live in today. I had a little chat with David a little earlier regarding my own personal story with migration. I was born and raised in Lebanon, continued most of my education, and spent most of my childhood in a war-torn country. Uh, Many of you might know that the war hit hard in Lebanon or reached its brink in the 70s, and it went on up until the early 90s. I am a generation of this war. My family never left Lebanon. I was born in 1979 when it was really the peak of war in Lebanon. When I say war, that really includes civil war, sectorial war, internationalized war, all types of war really passed through this little country on the Mediterranean. As I was growing up, all I witnessed was destruction and killing and hatred and running from one region to another, running from one area to another in Lebanon with my family looking for a safe haven to have us be protected, myself and my younger brother. So we grew up 1 year going to school, another not going to school, 1 year with electricity, another 2 years without electricity, always concerned about can we have access to food, to water, you name it, all kinds of challenges that you can imagine.
You left to go to the United States. Yours was not irregular migration. Presumably you conformed with the rules out there. But did you find there was an attitude towards migrants that surprised you as a young person?
You mean when I
When you arrived in the
when
United
I
States, or perhaps wherever you went on your journey there?
well, when I arrived to the United States, I actually felt very warm environment, really, because as we all know, the United States is a land of migrants, land of immigration. So I was surprised actually to find that there was a huge Lebanese and Middle Eastern community that already migrated years and years back to the United States and to South America. And they were very interconnected in many ways. One very simple example on that is that Brazil, for example, alone has about 8 million Lebanese of Lebanese descendants. 8 million, while Lebanon's population is no more than 4 million Lebanese on paper.
So can I ask you this? If you felt warmly welcomed, do you think if the young Salim went over there now, went to that country now, um, would you expect to get the same kind of welcome mat, or do you think attitudes have changed?
I think, yes, attitude have changed globally because migration has took many different shapes and forms due to many different factors over the years, over the decades. I think people now move around the world for many different reasons. Some are looking for a better life, some are looking for security, some are looking for a job and a decent living, and different countries really are approaching those migrants in many different ways. In my opinion, I think some countries, mostly in Europe, most recently, have been challenged a lot because a lot of the countries in struggle were closer to Europe. So there was a much larger, much sophisticated migration from different Middle Eastern and African countries into Europe, which probably, in my own assessment, based on my own discussions with a lot of European friends, created a lot of tension in Europe. So the behavior in Europe towards migration became much different than it is in the United States.
So attitudes have changed. The young Amin would not be welcomed in quite the same way. Perhaps, we don't know. Let me ask the three of you separately, and Felipe, I'll come to you in just a moment because your area of expertise is particularly refugees. But let me ask you, Savaş, if I could come to you first of all, why do you think it has changed? Because it's not just towards what we're talking about tonight, which is irregular migration. It is about migration as a whole. Why have people seemingly become not as generous as they used to be?
I mean, the question is not that easy, actually, quite complicated, because the root causes of the migration and the volume of migration is so different from geographies to geographies. But to say a few things quickly, um, in some parts of the world, the volume of irregular migration is so high and forces the capacities of governments and states, both in terms of socially and economically as well. There are also some, groups that are instrumentalizing the migratory flows for some gains, and the discourse of those groups generally, in a way, manage to get an upper hand over the others' discourse.
So it is opportunism.
I mean, kind of instrumentalization of the issue for some gains.
Okay.
It might be political, it might be economic, it might be many different aspects.
Which
But this creates, a perception, leads to a perception in the society that migration is something bad for the host countries.
Well, we will get on to the benefits
Yes.
for both the migrants themselves and society, as you all see it, in just a moment. But Leila, this brings us nicely to something you mentioned to me when we were talking before this panel, which is that your position is a new one. And it's been established so that attitudes can be changed, or at least that is what you hope to be able to change the attitudes which we've just heard explained have hardened over the years or even just a couple of generations?
Well, my role as a special representative of the Secretary General of the Council of Europe on Refugees and Migration was put in place in 2016, beginning of 2016 in January, after after the crisis due to the refugees coming from Syria. There was a need to have a person who could coordinate all the support to be given to to the refugees and to the migrants. It is new in that sense. I come from the Council of Europe, so I just wanted to also...
You're reminding me of the mistake I made.
The
While we're there, I wonder if I could ask the organisers just to turn the volume up just a little bit of our speakers, because I'm finding it quite hard to hear what is being said, and I think the same goes for the audience. Is that possible? Somebody just to up the volume of the speakers on the floor? Well, let's carry on now. Yes, Leila.
Yeah, the Council of Europe, where we have 47 member states, and which is based in Strasbourg, and which mandate is based on human rights, the rule of law, and democracy. And in my role, what I have to do, I can carry out missions in countries to look at what is happening in countries and then come up with relevant recommendations to support countries to overcome their challenges. I have to coordinate the work of the Council of Europe in terms of migration and refugees. Also in the framework of an action plan that we have for vulnerable people, our focus is vulnerable people. And
are you talking about young people, young women in particular perhaps?
Young women, women in general, girls and children, especially unaccompanied children.
And can I ask you this? You talked about going into particular countries and having a dialogue. And I wonder if you'd care to share with us which particular countries you find need the most attention within Europe.
Well, I just started in my new role in January. I haven't been to any country for the moment, but my predecessors they did a lot of visits. In 2016, there were a lot of visits to the frontline countries, Italy, Spain, because at the time it was the southern countries who were, let's say, faced with the most challenges. My predecessor last year went to Bosnia-Herzegovina, and he also visited Turkey, where there is, as you know, a high number of refugees and migrants.
We'll ask Sabash about Turkey's position in this, if you don't mind, in just a moment, but I want to bring in every single one of the panellists. Martin, again, before the meeting started, you were explaining to me, and if I could summarise perhaps badly, the fact that your job is to make sure that everybody who does the same job within the same sector, in other words to do with migration, does it better.
Yes.
Does that imply criticism of what's gone before?
Thank you for the question. Now, what we try to do as ICPD is to cooperate with the institutions of the countries where we work in Asia, Europe, and Africa, to make sure that indeed those institutions have the capacities to work to indeed do their jobs better, that they work with each other. We facilitate dialogue between the countries, but it doesn't necessarily always involve direct criticism. It's working on the main aspects of migration. And migration you can approach from different aspects. You can take a very technical approach to it and say, okay, these measures make sense in order to manage migration governance or legal migration, or offering protection or fighting trafficking or managing borders. But in reality, most of what is migration is very political. It's a lot of politics which plays into the messaging on migration. So migration management becomes very often communication. And many of the measures that you hear, the reaction to the so-called migration crisis of 2015-16, which was a much bigger challenge for non-European for non-EU countries, which thought they had a big migration governance problem, but Turkey was hosting many more migrants at the time and refugees at the time than the whole of Europe. I think there were cities in Turkey who were hosting more Syrians than the whole of the EU. But the communication there of this unregulated groups of migrants entering Europe led to restrictive measures in the area of legal migration. It didn't make any sense, but the messaging was political. And I think it's important that we try to, as migration professionals, take a very holistic approach and say, okay, we have to be able to implement a lot of operational technical measures within a very complex political framework.
Well, I'm wondering, therefore, and we'll come to this, whether we should actually think of refugees and migrants almost as one and the same, not as individuals, but in terms of one body. And I want to come to you, Filippo, because on your own website, United Nations High Commission for Refugees, it says refugees are persons fleeing armed conflict or persecution. Migrants choose to move not because of a direct threat of persecution or death, but mainly to improve their lives by finding work, etc., etc., family reunion or other reasons. Does that mean we should not feel so sorry for migrants? Should we feel more sympathy for refugees? Have migrants just made this choice themselves?
No, I don't think so. Everybody has dignity that needs to be respected. But I want to go back to what you just said, because I think it is important to maintain that distinction. For a variety of reasons, but mostly because people that flee from war, from persecution, from discrimination, have an established set of rights that can be invoked so that those rights are respected, if you see what I mean. My job, the job of my organization, now we do many things. We're a very big organization. We do a lot of practical work to help the refugees, but fundamentally our core work is to be the custodians of those principles, conventions, laws, that we can invoke when people knock at the door of other countries, fleeing from all these things and trying to seek refuge. I think it's important to maintain. Migrants, people that move for other reasons, have their own rights, have their own aspirations, which are very important. But
there is a very
but
big
they
difference
don't
between
enjoy
rights
the
and
same.
aspirations.
They don't enjoy the same legal status, and therefore need to be protected otherwise. That's an important distinction to maintain. However, I want to make one more point, if I may. There is a lot of overlap these days that makes it very difficult. People move along the same routes, often trafficked by the same criminals. And the perception of these flows that are mixed, as we call them, is often manipulated by the same politicians. Somebody mentioned that. I think you use the more polite word, but that's what it is. Manipulation. These are all enemies, need to be pushed back. This is very common in the West, in the rich world, when in reality, as far as refugees go, the majority is not there. I'm very conscious, by the way, that I'm talking in the country that hosts the largest number of refugees in the world, Turkey, and I'm sitting next to the minister of the country that hosts the largest number of refugees per capita of any country in the world. So I'm in good company here. But what I mean is this manipulation, which has been bad for both refugees and migrants, is really prevalent in the wealthier countries, and a perception has been developed that the problem is there. The problem of refugees in particular is all over the world, and in particular in countries that have less resources, not more resources.
Well, in that case, and by all means do raise a hand or just jump in if you want to say something. Sabash, let me ask you this. Do you think that Turkey has taken in all these refugees, A, because it had to, secondly, because it has the capacity, the moral capacity and the heart to do this? And has that changed the country?
I mean, it's not just about, capacity. It's, of course, Turkey is a big country and has a capacity. Yet it doesn't mean that its capacity, it directly relates to the capacity of the country. It's, first of all, the case in Syria was different. We have a territorial land border, a long land border. It's direct our neighbor. and it's a historical responsibility as well. But so about the second part of your question, its impact. I mean, how this impacted Turkey? If I didn't misunderstand you, uh, on many ways. I mean, it depends on how you look at it. I mean, if you look at it from economic perspective, of course, you know, we may think that it boosted Turkish economy, Turkish labor market, but also we may say that it also creates an extra burden on Turkish, you know, governmental system. Yet the key point is not about its impact on Turkish system or Turkish economy. But the key point is that it's an, you know, historical responsibility, it's a legal responsibility by international norms as well, because we are also a party to Geneva Refugee Convention. So it's a responsibility for us to fulfill. It's not just a legal responsibility, but beyond it, it was an historical responsibility for us, because we shared a long history with these people. I mean, if you ask about the impact of this big influx of Syrians to Turkey, I mean, I can say lots of different things from different angles, and it might be too detailed.
Has it at all been portrayed in a negative way in Turkey? Has it been perceived that way? I'm sure some people have tried to make it out.
Let me link your question with your previous question. Why these attitudes have changed over the recent century or recent time, let's say. So that's the reason, because some people tend to depict the impact of refugees only from negative way. And as I said, this discourse managed to get an upper hand, over other discourses. So therefore, we need to increase our efforts in a joint way to show people that refugees are not just refugees, as High Commissioner described. I mean, those who need protection, but migration itself, in broadly speaking, is not always something bad for the host countries.
Which leads me to you, I mean, if I may, because Turkey's issue with the influx of Syrians is relatively recent. First time I went to Lebanon back in the early 1980s, the whole of the southern suburbs was a refugee camp for the Palestinians. Since then, we've had the influx of many, many Syrians in the north and the east of the country. Has Lebanon come to just accept this as a way of life?
You know, we cohabitate very fast in Lebanon. What happened is basically, I think Lebanon is a perfect demonstration of how crises that led to refugees really turned more into migration as well. If you look at Lebanon today, as I mentioned earlier, there are about 12 to 15 million, depends on the study, Lebanese people outside Lebanon. Those are a result of something that happened. Those are a result of years and decades of refugees flooding into Lebanon due to all the unfortunate things that happened throughout the history, starting with the Palestinians, moving back to the Syrians. Lebanese people gradually, and particularly within certain sects in Lebanon, started feeling that this nation is not theirs anymore, and they need to go look for another nation. They need to go look for another.
Was that resentment or a lack of opportunity?
Both. It's a mix of both, because if you approach a lot of Lebanese people that migrated long time ago, they will always blame the reality why they migrated. They will tell you, we feel Lebanon is not ours anymore. We need to look for a new place. And today, as well, this message, we can feel it, unfortunately, even more and more due to a lot of different factors. But there is no doubt that the issue of refugees, the way it weighed on Lebanon, on the infrastructure, on the morale, on the existence of Lebanese people, really turned Lebanon into a big migration spot into the entire world. And the result has been 15 million Lebanese people outside Lebanon, with a country that holds now about 20 to 30% of its population is refugees, more or less. I'm not being very accurate on the numbers.
And can you say, by talking to people who've got more experience of this than you have, because you're only in your early 40s. Can you say whether attitudes have hardened? Because when I first went there, I think it was about 1983, the civil war was still going on. And the Palestinians, to some extent, were actually largely welcomed.
Mhm. No, attitudes absolutely changed a lot. I mean, what I felt, at least going back to Lebanon the past 2 years, I felt that the Lebanese people who are still living in Lebanon have a completely different feeling towards refugees or migrants or anybody, if you want to put it under any category under the sun, that comes to Lebanon who is not Lebanese. There is a feel of hatred, of tension, of resentment, and any Lebanese that you ask now tells you anybody who's not Lebanese to me is not welcome because they feel that they lost their country to those factors.
How do you, Martin and Leila, combat that?
Well, what I wanted to, listening to all of you, I wanted also to say that member states have
I wonder if you could pull the
yeah,
microphone a
do
little
you hear
closer.
me now?
A little better.
They have obligations. It's not just they have legal obligations because they are parties to conventions, to the 1951 convention, but also to the European Convention on Human Rights. The moment a person puts their feet on the territory of a member state of the Council of Europe, they have to abide by the European Convention on Human Rights and also the 1951 Convention. So what I meant is that there are obligations. It's up to member states to accept or not accept.
Indeed, but what you're not going to do if you insist only on people honouring their obligations, what you're not going to be able to do, I would suggest, is to get rid of the resentment. And that was really the point of my question. How do you change attitude?
How to change attitude? It's a long-term job to change attitudes. It has to start somewhere, but as you said, Sabash, and also when things are so much politicized, it becomes quite difficult to change attitudes. Because this is a politicized matter in many of our countries. So we in the Council of Europe are working on many fronts, like how to have an influence on hate speech, for instance, against migrants. How can we change attitudes by working with the relevant people to not have hate speech against migrants? For example, we have a number of activities like that, but this cannot be done quickly. It's not a quick fix.
May I suggest that sounds rather wishy-washy,
yeah.
rather hopeful, not practical. Are there any other things you can do? Because again, once you're doing is you're enforcing something that may not be popular. You're telling people what they can and cannot say, what they must and must not do, etc., etc.
That's what before coming to this panel, I was discussing with my colleagues, and I was saying, we in the Council of Europe, we have a lot of guidelines, we had a lot of standards, we have a lot of recommendations. The important thing is to implement them, but it's also up to the political will to implement them. I don't want to go into the details of everything we are doing to help this to happen. But at the end of the day, if there is no political will, this will not be implemented, in my view.
And to some extent, that depends on who's running the politics of a particular country. Maybe it's just demonstrative of the times in which we live. Martin, I could see you wanted to come in.
Yeah, maybe a few things without going back too far in time, but we have to be careful that we are not going to say, oh, the attitudes have changed so much. If you read newspapers around the turn of the 20th century and you would look for Irish, the problem of Irish immigrants in the US, you will see that there was a very negative reporting on them, and that has happened all the time. So the fact that there is an unease of arrival of new groups in societies is something of all times and indeed also of all regions. it's not that Europe has become more negative. We have seen the same things in other societies in the world where migrants have arrived, where tensions have appeared. And secondly, what I also find important to stress is, yes, there is an important objective by governments to show we are in control, we know who is coming, but there is also an important aspect of showing we are compassionate. The Turkish society welcomed millions of arrivals when the Syrian crisis started. We see the same thing happening now in Central Europe with the arrivals of millions of Ukrainians. There's a lot of push behind it, and that also changes politics. So you see that there is, we have to see how long will that take, will it lead to problems, what problems will there be? At the moment, my biggest concern, for example, and we saw the same to a certain extent with the arrival of Syrians, is the danger for the refugees themselves. They might be exploited, they might be in situations of abuse, while at the same time the majority of them will be hosted.
But does it not depend in the current atmosphere where you come from? At the moment we are seeing hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of unfortunate people from Ukraine being gladly accepted in a lot of European countries. But they are, by and large, white Christians.
Yes, but what happened in the summer of 2015, in the autumn of 2015? Thousands, myself included, but many people stood at the European borders and helped the refugees and welcomed them. So that was a very open reaction. So I don't think you can just put this because of a neighbor of the EU is in crisis, and it is white and it is Christian predominantly. Yes, the society opens its arms, like Turkey did to its neighbors. So I think it's too easy to go into a direction of saying, okay, they are white. Yeah, they're white, but that does not make, we should just be as generous as there has been to others.
In a few minutes I'm going to ask people on the floor to think of some questions that they might like to put. In particular, what was crossing my mind as I was listening to these stories, Amin's in particular, he'd gone away, he came back, he talked about the refugee problem in his own country. Perhaps some of you within the audience have experience of that. And I think we hope we do have microphones that we can give to you, and you can share your thoughts with the audience and with the panel as well. Felipe, can I put this to you? We talk about enforcing laws, and on this program we're talking about irregular migration, which by the definition of the ILO is illegal immigration. Why do you think there is so much resentment against governments enforcing the rules of entry into their country?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but can I just, and maybe this is related, I want to go back for a moment because it's all connected, what the minister said and others said. I agree with that analysis, by the way. You know, I've been visiting Lebanon, actually living in Lebanon too for a while, so I've seen the shift in attitude. Lebanon is a very extreme case, let's also remember that. A very small country with a very complex balance of power and groups, very exposed geopolitically, and therefore refugee influxes just make it much more complicated for everybody. But this is true for many countries that host refugees, especially countries that have few resources. And this is why, if you read, talking of norms and enforcing, if you read the Refugee Convention, it's very interesting. The Refugee Convention says in 1951, refugees have lost the protection of their country, therefore seek protection in another country, but that protection is not the responsibility just of that country, has to be international, has to be a shared responsibility. This is a very interesting concept. You may say it's idealistic. It's actually very practical. And look at what is happening with the Ukrainian refugees. 2.5 million today. We passed today the mark of 2.5 million. European countries, including countries that have been rather resistant in the past to any notion that you should share that responsibility now find themselves all of a sudden and quite unexpectedly in the situation of having to host hundreds of thousands. And what do? They ask for that international solidarity and sharing, which means financial assistance, which means it may mean at some point that they cannot hold all of them, so they have to resettle them to other countries. I say this because you ask what's the antidote to those bad feelings, which are inevitable. Public opinions are very generous one moment, and then public opinions are very volatile. And let me repeat, and sometimes in some countries they're very manipulated by some politicians, and therefore they change. But one of the main antidotes, and certainly one that my organization is promoting very actively, is to try to mobilize resources and what we call burden sharing. And that has, there are many, this is not wishy-washy. That's very, very practical, and it is happening in Europe as we speak now. And finally, just to say, yes, Europe might have opened its doors today because these are neighbors, etc. And I don't know if it's just a matter of color or culture. Certainly it plays certainly a role. It's also very geopolitical here, right? Europe has an issue with this war, so it takes the people that come from the war. But I think that by doing this, they have created an important precedent. It will be more difficult for European states after what is happening now to say, for others, we don't have responsibility sharing. Let them all stay in the first country, or we don't take this group. So I am an optimist by nature, and otherwise I wouldn't do what I do. And I think that we need to capitalize on what's happening now to restate this notion: if refugees move, everybody should share the responsibility and contribute to the response.
The point I was trying to make, and I'm sorry if I didn't get it clear, was that while an awful lot of the conversation shifts on how badly migrants and refugees are treated these days, we're talking about irregular migration, which by definition is when people break the laws of the country they are going to get in. Is it a fact that these days we are seeing more and more vilification of countries that do that? They're simply enforcing their own laws when in fact they have every right to do so.
Yeah, I understand now better, sorry. Here again I have to go back to my initial distinction though, because you see, migration, as you yourself have defined it in the beginning, I would agree very much with the way you described it, needs to be regular. And states have the right to enforce this, and therefore not to accept irregular migration. Refugees very often move irregularly. Sorry if I'm a bit subtle here. Refugees sometimes have to break the rules to flee and to enter from illegal crossing points, for example, to save their lives. That's different, because then they will be protected by another set of legal measures. But back to irregular migration, and I think that states have the right to enforce against irregular migration. However, maybe this needs to be looked at again. Why, for example, so many irregular migrants, in order to protect themselves, when they get to a country, ask for asylum, as if they were refugees, even if they don't have any reasons for doing that, because they know that that's one avenue to get in a country. Therefore, my point, the point we always make is, if states improve the way migration is managed, by the way, giving more visas, regularizing more rather than continuing restricting it, then you will have less problem of irregular migration and less abuse of the asylum channel to enter a country. I don't know if this is clear. This is a bit of a complex notion, but it is a very important
We have about 15 minutes left. I would like to throw it open to the floor. I don't know whether anybody wants to pick up on the point that I made earlier on. Perhaps you have personal reasons for wanting to do this, but I saw the gentleman in the front row. Do we have a microphone that we can pass to our guest speakers? You may well have to. That's fantastic. I think one's being brought over. We'll probably have to give it a bash just to make sure that it works. Can I just ask one thing? Unless it's a very personal and pertinent story, could you make it a question rather than a statement?
It is going to be a question rather than a statement, but it's not a personal experience. If there is anyone else that is going to...
That sounds germane. Please, please. But I ask people to keep questions short.
Yes. Thank you so much for being here. First of all, thank you so much for gracing us with your presence. It was a very informative experience for me. I study environmental security and environmental refugees, and I think it's an important paradigm shift between normal refugees and environmental ones, because those people are not actually running away from internal strife or war, but instead they are running away because their very livelihoods, the soil that they produce their agricultural needs from, is either degrading or being eradicated basically out of existence. And my question is going to be that it's going to be a jurisdictional or institutional question, and I would like to ask it to Mr. Grandi, High Commissioner. Do you think there should be a discrepancy between the terms refugee and environmental refugee? Because this is one of the things that's being heavily debated upon. Because, or is it you think it's going to be beneficial for those people that are specifically affected from the detrimental effects of the environmental crisis? Or you think...
I do find questions that have an if, an or, and an and, and a but in them that are effectively 4 questions in one.
I'm finishing it. I'm so sorry.
Felipe, yeah?
You think is it going to be detrimental for the actual refugees? It's going to damage the political effect of the term refugees themselves? Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't usually use this word climate refugees or environmental refugees because you get into a very complicated debate. You know, refugees are refugees. They flee from conflict, from persecution, from discrimination, from violence. Stick to that. If you tamper with that definition, you lose out, not gain any space for the refugees. However, among the people that are forced to move for climatic reasons, there are many that will have protection needs. And the existing conventions apply. In fact, most of the people that you are mentioning do not flee just because there is not enough water or whatever. They flee because there is conflict related to that. So automatically they are refugees. You see what I mean? We need to be a bit pragmatic there, and we need to be careful because we live in a world in which if it was today, 1951, we would not get a convention and we would not get the notion of refugees. So now putting these things on the negotiating table of definitions is very, very risky for the protection of the people in flight. I think that the existing conventions on refugees, but also other sets of rights related to people on the move, are sufficient to protect, if they are correctly applied, of course, are sufficient to protect people that flee also because of climatic reasons.
Thank you very much indeed, Filippo. I would ask this lady in the blue sitting here to pose a question to one of our other panelists rather than Filippo, if you don't mind.
My question is for Mr. Grandi.
Well, I tell you what, I'm going to bat it to somebody else and see whether they can take it on. Please carry on.
Tamam. Chevolichar, I am a psychology master student. Countries have a right to not want irregular migration. However, humanity should not be ignored in migration flows. I will say that the treatment faced by immigration at the Belarusian-Polish border was extremely difficult. Also last month, 19 refugees pushed back by Greece with inhuman treatment froze to death. International institutions and public opinion were silent in the face of all this. Now an open door policy is being implemented against the migration flow from Ukraine. What do you think about this dual attitudes?
I'm going to ask Felipe to keep quiet on this one, if you don't mind, and throw it to the far end. Sabash, you can come in first of all, and
Yes,
then we'll go to
I
Leila
can
and Martin.
say a few things, but if you let me, before answering to this question, which I will for sure,
Please do.
I would like to say a few things because I mean, irregular migration, regardless of its cause, I mean, regardless of its connection to the forced migration or voluntary migration, is a big phenomenon that should be addressed, a worldwide, a global phenomenon. So, I mean, I wish we could speak more about this aspect as well. Lots of things to be done on the global level. Otherwise, I mean, if we limit the irregular migration, if we leave people stranded on some borders, such as, for example, Iranian-Afghanistan border, Turkish-Afghanistan border, on the Aegean Sea between Turkish-Greek border, so we cannot reach to anywhere. So it's a global phenomenon that needs to be tackled seriously through joint efforts. And let me link this argument with the question. Mr. Grandi's remark about the country's obligations to the vis-à-vis refugees is something different. It doesn't mean, he himself also said the same thing, government can abuse the migrants. There isn't such a thing. All people, regardless of their status, legal or irregular, have fundamental human rights, and those also include to access to at least asylum application. So the case, as the lady expressed, the last month's incident on Turkish-Greek border, and similar others. I mean, due to the numbers of the death in that tragic event, everyone is familiar with that incident. But every month, we witness many similar incidents, unfortunately. So therefore, we cannot solve this issue just closing, securing the borders and making sure that irregular migrants, regardless of the cause of the migrants, to make sure we will, through making sure that we will be able to keep them out of borders. We should address the issue, the root causes of the issue, the fundamental causes of the issue, and we need to find a global, develop a global perspective for it.
Thank you very much indeed. Leila, I saw you very diligently catching up on paperwork, but I'm going to ask you to start speaking now because that's what you're here for.
Well, I was... yes. No, it was a good question, and and you will say I'm wishy-washy, so
No, I wasn't. I was just saying that some ideas can be concrete and some can just be ideas.
You know, I wanted to say that, again, I will look legal to you maybe, but I'm a lawyer, so you see, we have a Court of Human Rights in the Council of Europe, which is very, looking into those cases. I mean, I know that at the moment there are pending cases before our court related to issues that you refer to. And the court is also taking some measures, interim measures, against, individuals can apply to this court, which is a unique mechanism. And they can have the right, it can take some time. I know that there is also criticism about the court that the case takes a long time, but the court looks at these cases and then they are enforced. So it's not maybe immediate, but this is the most important thing.
It's another plank, and it's an essential one, you say.
It is an essential word that we have to keep in mind. What I mean is not that international organizations, you said, are silent. No, they are not. They are working. Maybe they are not as visible as that, but they are working, and we have to cherish these international bodies that we have. Yeah.
Martin, I'm going to come to you in just a moment, but I want to end with, as we started with him, with another aspect to his story. It'll be a surprise question, but I'm sure you'll be quite capable of answering it. Martin, what do you want to say to what you've heard from the floor and your other panelists?
Well, I think, first of all, I want to echo what you said, that indeed the influence of the core decisions are extremely important also for forming the migration debate. But I would also like to continue on what was said by Mr. Awash. We have to look at international cooperation and the facilitation of intergovernmental dialogues. Turkey is chairing the Budapest process, which brings together countries from the Silk routes up to Europe. to consult with each other and to discuss migration issues together, to get to common approaches and to get away from this very often simplistic narrative of countries of origin, destination and transit, where most of the countries combine all of these aspects at the same time, plus are all countries of reintegration. That is what demands an approach to migration, which irregular migration is one element of it. As the High Commissioner has said, many more aspects feed into that. The promotion of legal migration and mobility, the protection of the rights along the routes and control. All of these elements play together, and I think that is what makes migration management so interesting, but also so highly complex in what we're dealing with.
And so very vital at this particular time. I don't think it's ever been more important than it is. I return to you, Amin, because you told us how you left the country, you told us how you were welcomed in the United States. You said perhaps if you went now because of the climate it wouldn't be quite the same reception, but you are now back home. And I want you to try and lift this room, not with your personal story necessarily, but with the idea of people leaving their home country but going back and being able then to do something, to help with their society, to help people who have the same roots as them, and to not think of migrants as people who are simply moving away and never going home.
No, absolutely. I mean, my personal experience, I'm really using it as a case today to a lot of the young people in Lebanon, because when I came back and took a decision to stay and serve my country and try to help within all those problems, everybody asked me, why would you do that? Why would you leave and come back to this mess? I said very simply, if my generation, who is really bridging the divide between two generations struggling now in Lebanon, not really understanding each other, Lebanon will be in a very difficult place, and I believe this is in many other countries, because the youth in Lebanon now have a complete disconnect with the political regime. That's a completely different generation and looks at migration and looks at refugees in a completely different way, or a different compassionate way than the young generation. One thing I can really today take advantage of this platform to share that I have felt is very important and much needed by the international community to reconsider. And as a lawyer, I as well recommend to look at it from a legal structure, because I hear this every single day in Lebanon, that the host countries or host community concept within what we call today refugees is very important to be studied on a case-by-case situation. And I say that because if you compare Lebanon, as Filippo mentioned today, on a per capita GDP, it's really a country that has the largest, refugee presence. This is a country that is in total collapse economically. This is a country that has a very, very weak infrastructure. And there is no way that this country can be compared under any law, under any regulation, under any international understanding, can be compared to another country that has a decent economy, has strong infrastructure, and can accommodate or host. Because host country and host community today in Lebanon is a big discussion, and it can really go out more on the global level, because I'm sure the same question will be asked by other countries as we see the refugee crisis growing. A lot of the host countries and host communities will say, how can you require or ask me by law and by international regulations to handle this crisis as a country that can accommodate? So this, I think, is a very important update that the system needs, because today Lebanon, if I give you a simple example that I'm dealing with today, which is the crisis of bringing wheat into Lebanon. When I think I want to feed the people of Lebanon, I as well have to think that as well I have 2 million plus people that I need to bring wheat for that are not Lebanese people, that are refugees, Syrian or Palestinian. And I felt a lot of anger from the Lebanese people as a Minister of Economy responsible for food security, now to prioritize Lebanese people on other people. And it's a serious problem. now with Ukraine and Russia, because we import most of our food security or food resources from those countries. But I have to politically explain who I'm going to favor. To me, they are all human beings. I cannot say I want to bring food for the Lebanese and leave the Syrian or the Palestinian starving. But I think those are questions that create very good dialogue now to look into all those host countries and host communities from a different perspective.
Indeed, and they are questions that are being asked. We don't have any more time. People either have important business meetings or important plates of food to go and visit, which in the circumstances is perhaps not the right way to end this. But listen, thank you very, very much indeed. Absolutely nothing wishy-washy about what was said on this panel. Appreciate your time. Thank you very much indeed to the panel. Thank you, David.